This is what we were waiting for. All of the hype that we had last week should have been for this episode, because in my opinion, episode 1072 was a near perfect episode of anime. Solid art, ambitious animation, fantastic vocal performances, and most importantly, it was paced really well. They kept filler to a minimum, and when there was anime-only material, it actually felt like it added to the things it is that was happening. I think the only criticism I have in that regard was the first 2 minutes after the opening. That's all recap and that's all standard, but it does feature them reusing the same sequence that got used 3 times in the last episode. So that's now 4 times in 2 episodes I've done that. But after that, I have to say, pretty damn smooth sailing through this episode. Although there was one thing, just one thing that I really didn't like, and I'm actually amazed that Toei had the audacity to actually do it. It's almost at the point where you need to admire just how blatant they're being. But we'll get to that in a bit, because it is so unimportant compared to Gear 5th being brilliantly realized in what I think is its best incarnation. I said this last time, but Gear 5th was made for animation, and it hits so differently with the sound effects, the music, the motion, and with all of the fun and life given to it by Mayumi Tanaka as Luffy. Speaking of sound effects for a bit, I have to say, perfectly done in this episode. In 1071, there were times, especially when Kaido was being spun around, that I felt like we were getting on the border of obnoxious. I really don't like being bombarded with noise, but this right here, this is the sweet spot. The opening fight sequence with Kaido was an absolute joy to watch. The whole part where Kaido swallows Luffy and he turns this deadly digestion into a fun carnival ride. And it's kind of brutal when you think about it. Luffy is riding Kaido's insides. He's just bouncing about and sliding down all of those dragon organs. To be honest, I don't know what specific organs dragons have, but whatever they do have, this cannot be good for them. But this is also a great example of anime filler that actually enhances One Piece. You don't see Luffy having fun inside of Kaido, which is a weird sentence to say, but you don't see that in the manga. Luffy gets eaten and then we just very quickly become a balloon. And here's the thing about Gear 5th, right? It's not a power-up that's designed to be optimal. As in, it's not a power-up designed to make you win quickly. It's a power-up designed to be fun. And in the manga, the pacing is lightning fast. At times, it can feel like the exact opposite of the slow anime pacing problem. But for Gear 5th, what that specifically means is that we don't actually get to take a lot of time to just chill and let Luffy enjoy the freedom being granted to him by this form. We always have to just keep moving on to the next thing. So I think that this transformation is a gift, not just to animation, but to this specific animation company that desperately needs to fill time. It's an open invitation for filler fun, and they absolutely nailed it in this episode. Also, this video is sponsored by Bloodline: Heroes of Lithos, a fantasy RPG hero collecting extravaganza featuring elves, dwarves, demigods, dragonborn, so much more, and in practically any combination, because you can customize your champion, marrying any 2 bloodlines to create well over 1,000 hybrids that inherit the talents and traits of their parents. But something I cannot emphasize enough is just how great the graphics of this game are, which is one of those things that you hear everywhere, but with Bloodline, it's actually true. The graphics are almost absurdly good, as are the constant updates with new unique abilities and companions being released every 2 weeks. And in between, you can enjoy some extremely rewarding late game PvP, earning points in seasonal guild wars. You can and should play Bloodline: Heroes of Lithos by clicking my link in the description or scanning the QR code if you're viewing on a PC, with new players receiving a free special starter pack worth $20 available for the next 30 days, featuring 1 summoning crystal, 100k gold, and 100 diamonds, which not only directly supports this channel, it allows me to pay my artists and editors so that they can do things like eat food. I hear they like to do that. But also another thing, the first 30 players who leave their in-game account ID and username in the comment section below will receive a free legendary female orc champion, Ugrul, one of the absolute best warriors to carry you in the game. So do that thing, but for now it's back to you, me. I also really enjoyed how they handled Balloon Kaido, and actually Kaido in general, remembering that most great comedy acts require a straight man, and Kaido is performing his role in this skit with the utmost dedication. Something I didn't expect was how well the anime conveyed the sort of wacky brutality of what's happening to Kaido. Like when Luffy inflated him, my stomach felt this sense of phantom pain just watching what was happening to Kaido. And the craziest part was when Luffy was stretching his arms through Kaido's eyeballs, and there was this particular scream of pain from Kaido, like proper, this is guttural primal pain. And that made me really glad that I don't have cartoons inhabiting my eyes, because it sounds painful. Also, the dude getting smashed through the skull at the end was pretty brutal as well. And I really liked the boing sound that the anime added, because it looks like it hurt, like it really hurt. But the boing is still somehow appropriate. I don't even know how to explain it. Because if something like this ever existed in any other media, something so simultaneously serious and brutal, but so wacky and cartoonish. I also appreciate that the anime is focusing on enhancing Kaido's experience appearance as well. For the most part in the manga, he just kind of ignores all of the weird stuff that's happening. But in this episode, he even had a line practically begging Luffy to take this fight seriously. Then there's also a close-up of his like tiny flailing dragon arms. So no, Kaido, there is no seriousness to be had here. There was seriousness happening elsewhere though. The scene that surprised me the most during the whole episode was that dramatic discussion between Law and Kid. Another thing that didn't happen in the manga, with some nice mini scenes of a lot of the characters still fighting on Onigashima. So I'm fully aware that this is the sort of thing that I would usually complain about. But here's why this works. Firstly, it's directed well. It is directed really well. The visuals are great, the lighting is dramatic, and the pacing is constantly moving. Even though it's filler, it still feels like we're getting somewhere, which is very hard to do. And as it should be, this scene should have a bit of a frantic vibe about it, because the whole idea is Law pointing out that they are surrounded by problems, and all of those problems do come with solutions, but that solution is death. There's death from above them with Kaido, there's death from below them because they're on a floating island destined to crash, and there's also just death in general all around them with the fire and the remaining beast pirates. So from their perspective, this situation is pretty hopeless. And weirdly enough, that actually opens things up for a bit of a moment with Eustace Kid, because I have to say, this scene did a lot for him. I liked seeing his never give up attitude and his vow not to go down before Luffy or Law, even if they have no chance of winning. It's really cool to see. The idea that amongst all of this hopelessness and probable death, the Kid is not going to give up no matter what. And also really funny considering what goes on to happen to him in the manga. But in the manga, Kid sorely lacks moments like that, so I think the anime actually doing him a little bit of justice. But the reason why this scene works most for me is because it puts a lot of work into immediately being subverted. We have this confrontation of realism interrupted by a gigantic cartoon head falling through the roof. It's a pretty severe snap in atmosphere that warrants the eye-popping reactions that all of our characters have upon seeing Luffy. Well, actually, I will say that I'm not as sold on these eye pops, and I think it's because they're all pretty stagnant. You don't actually get to see the motion of the eye popping, which is the appeal of it to me. So it feels very similar to the manga effects that I'm just not a big fan of. But the part of the episode I was most excited to see was Giant Luffy, because that is when this transformation floored me in the manga, and I have to say it was okay. What I liked most was what we saw right before it. You had the thunder and the lightning, and every now and then there was just this silhouetted flash of Luffy behind the clouds. And then the silhouette would get bigger and bigger. And then just before the reveal, you see his massive face before the whole form comes out. That was really cool. It built up the anticipation so well. But with that said, it definitely hit me a lot less than the manga did. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but let's go ahead and work it out. I think it definitely has something to do with the full revelation. I do feel like something is lacking here compared to the manga version. Like when Luffy emerges from the clouds, his face feels very plastic. Like instead of mischievous and having fun, his anime face just looks very neutral and mannequin-y. I also feel like there's just something a bit off about the perspective. In the anime, Luffy feels very long and thin, which I don't think helps the feeling of giantness compared to this huge chonk in the sky from the manga. I'm obviously nitpicking here, that's what I do. And unlike Luffy himself, this is not a big deal. But as alluded to earlier, there was one thing that genuinely kind of annoyed me. And it was when Luffy got back up after being drained of energy and reactivated Gear 5th, where he pretty much literally turned Super Saiyan, with the yellow aura and the exact same sound effect from Dragon Ball. And look, I get it. Dragon Ball has a massive legacy with both One Piece and Toei. One Piece wouldn't be what it is without Dragon Ball laying that foundation. So if I had to make an argument for it, I guess you could say it's like a symbolic passing of the torch. But also, I really want Gear 5th to just be its own thing. And I really don't understand why Toei needs to keep turning One Piece into the same thing when they were making a completely different series airing a quarter of a century ago. Because this aura stuff isn't in the manga. Auras appear extremely rarely, and when they do, it's in a very minimal way. Stuff like having little bits of Haki aura covering Zoro's swords, but that's really it. It definitely never goes like full Super Saiyan. That aside, the scene had some nice stylistic choices as well. Like when Luffy loses energy, the anime chooses to desaturate him, which I thought was a really cool touch. His color and vibrance are fading, just as Momonosuke says that his voice is also fading. But I like this because it implies that Gear 5th is still somewhat active, whereas in the manga it looks like Luffy had returned to his normal form, which was a bit confusing because he was still acting all cartoony. And also because the more desaturated he gets, the more Luffy starts to resemble the old black and white rubber hose cartoons that this entire form is referencing. So I think it's just a good stylistic choice all around. And speaking of style, there was a very curious part where Luffy appeared to be using Kizaru Kizaru's light movement to bounce around instantly, which could not be more appropriate considering the conflict that looks like it's about to happen on Egghead Island. And I know it was just a bit of fun, we definitely should not be taking what we saw here seriously. This is not Luffy can use Kizaru's powers confirmed. It's all just stylized imaginary cartoon pirate stuff. But also, this is Gear 5th, so why not? I've not thought about this until now, but if he so wanted to, could Luffy actually mimic the devil fruit powers of others? I mean, he already kind of has mimicked a few powers to varying degrees of success. But again, why not? Why can't he? Gear 5th, in theory, it is maximum freedom. So surely he could imitate just about anything that anyone can do, because the only requirement is that Luffy needs to be able to imagine it. Towards the end of the episode, they started playing Over the Top, which could not be more appropriate for that final clash of episode 1072, because it's such a happy but also action-packed song, and weirdly enough, it's also quite nostalgic now. Right, so I just looked this up, and Over the Top was first used in episode 892, which aired in July 2019. So that's about, 180 episodes ago? Whoa. But of course, another way to put it is that it was just over 4 years ago that we first heard Over the Top. So that's wow. Wano is going to be, at least 200 episodes in the anime? Surely that's insane. And one thing I'm really glad they included was dipping into the first few pages of chapter 1046 with Luffy declaring that, of course, he'll be the Pirate King. It was a much better way to end this episode than the original chapter ending, which I believe was just Luffy saying, hey, isn't this fun, Kaido? And I think it always feels better to end an episode on a Pirate King declaration than to start with that. Although, being realistic, we're going to see this scene again in the first 2 minutes of the next episode anyway, I guess. It's like double dipping, they get the best of both worlds. But I think that episode 1072 very much vindicates my opinion on episode 1071. A lot of people weren't too thrilled that I basically gave it a bit of a meh review. As in, the Gear 5th stuff was great, but everything around it was pretty But I think the reason why is so clear. Episode 1072 shows what you can do without resorting to lazy filler sequences and flashbacks and constantly reusing animation, because this episode had about the same amount of material to work with as the last one in terms of manga. And I'd actually argue that episode 1072 had less because the chapter it's based on is almost 100% action, whereas the one before it had a ton of dialogue with the elders and Hiyori. What I do worry about is episodes from here on out. It's clear that these last two episodes have had a lot of time and money put into them, but One Piece is a fast food anime. It comes out on a weekly basis, and this sort of quality is inherently unsustainable. And I do think that the preview for next week's episode does look like we're going to be taking that inevitable step down. But at this point, look, I don't care. I'm just happy that we got one full episode of Gear 5th being amazing with solid pacing. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I might read them, I might not. Again, I make no promises.